Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this installment, Ross Lynch has the ability to make his wishes come true with the power of his status update. Kyle Moore, played by Ross Lynch, has just relocated from California to Connecticut with his recently separated mother, played by mclendon-covey, and is having trouble fitting in at his new senior high school. When his phone gets broken, he's given a new one by a mysterious kiosk owner, played by Josh Ostrovsky, which comes with his own app called Universe, and Kyle discovers that whatever status he enters into the app magically becomes real. With his powers, Kyle can pursue the girl of his dreams, Danny, played by Olivia Holt, but soon discovers that being popular isn't all it's cracked up to be. I don't think movies really know how to handle the internet yet. The proliferation of technology we've had in the last 10 to 15 years has really caused a lot of hassle for writers, because if you're trying to engineer a scenario where characters are either isolated or in a misunderstanding, they can just pull out their phones, call or text someone for help, and immediately walk right out of it. There's a reason why in so many horror films they call attention to there's no cell phone reception or their phones get destroyed in usually some kind of contrived way, because otherwise the plot wouldn't be allowed to function. But there's also the fact that we as a generation are spending more time looking at screens than we've ever done before, and that's one of the least compelling things you can do on the big screen. And when it comes to instant messaging and email, I think the language for that is still really being developed. The best you can hope for is that the messages pop up in speech bubbles next to the character's head. That's become a fairly commonplace trope. But whenever movies try to address the internet and social media, it becomes more absurd than anything else, especially if they're trying to do it in a genre setting, like they're trying to make it scary. Case in point, Friend Request, which I reviewed 2 years ago, as you might recall, which is one of the most unintentionally hilarious horror films from recent memory, where a teenage girl is haunted by a witch that invades her social media profile. And if you want a comedy film equivalent, Status Update is your movie. In fact, Friend Request and Status Update could play on a double bill with each other. And if you're not familiar with the premise of Status Update, it's basically, what if your social media updates came true? Look, I use Twitter. That's a terrible idea. And so too is this movie. By far this movie's biggest issue is that it's trying oh so hard to be hip and relevant. It's the kind of movie that starts with the lead character saying in voiceover narration, "I ascended to the top of my senior high school faster than a 3-second Instagram post." Cringe. And that line right there pretty much sums up the entire rest of Status Update. And they go all in on the social media references in its very earliest scenes, where everyone's playing around with phones and there's loads of app jokes. I think there's a Tinder joke in there, and it's just really embarrassing to witness. And it's blatantly obvious that the people that made this movie, high school for them is a distant memory. The guy that wrote this, he wrote the Zac Efron movie 17 Again, and in that film's defense, he was writing about someone who was going back to high school and comparing it to how it was then and how it is now. Status Update has no such excuses. It's just wildly out of touch and has no idea what high school life is like in 2018. The guy that directed this is Scott Speer, who did several of the Step Up movies, and you can tell that this film has sat on a shelf for a little bit because he already has another movie out. He did Midnight Sun, which also has Rob Riggle in it, but stars Bella Thorne, and that's just come out roughly around the same time. So clearly this is a film that they were very obviously embarrassed about. Gee, I wonder why. Anytime this movie tries to do social media, it is agonising. It feels like someone going, "Hey, what are the young people into?" There are scenes that are buttoned with social media posts. The big set piece moments will have collages of people posting on various social media. At one point, hashtag eat shit appears in massive letters across the screen. It is trying oh so very hard, and it's just so painful to see it land so thoroughly flat on its face. When it comes to the actual writing of this movie, a lot of it is fairly stock for a high school movie, especially in regards to a lot of the characters. So you have the jock, who is the star player of the hockey team, who's also a bully. You've got the mean girl. She's played by Courtney Eaton, who is Ross Lynch's ex-girlfriend in real life. They were dating at the time this movie was filmed back in 2016, and now they've subsequently broke up by the time it's been released. And you also have the nerdy best friend, who in this movie has been slightly updated to play MMORPGs because he's a geek. Do you get it? He's totally friendless. But then there are other characters in this film that are just puzzling. It feels like the actual creators of this movie researched what people are into these days by glancing off Tumblr. I'll give you an example. The main character's sister in this movie, she has this weird subplot where she starts dating someone who is really into anime. They set up that this guy was actually born in Connecticut, but he only speaks in Chinese because he's such a big fan of anime. Isn't anime more of a Japanese thing? I mean, immediately right there, you clearly don't understand what you're referencing. But then, she starts dressing like an anime character. She's got coloured wigs on, she's got these big flamboyant dresses. This comes out of nowhere, and it just suddenly happens. And I was genuinely perplexed watching this play out on screen, because what is the purpose of it? Is the fact that she's wearing these costumes meant to be funny in of itself? Is that the joke? Is there a punchline? There doesn't seem to be. It just happens. Like, what is the point of all this? And it just goes on in the background of this movie, and you just wonder, why? But that's a mere hors d'oeuvre to the fact that this movie has probably one of the worst written gay characters I can think of in a very, very long time. There is a character named Brian, and they set up this character in the introduction to a scene as being gay. They literally come out and say it, and to the point where there's even a gag in that scene where he's wearing women's jeans. Isn't that hilarious? Because he's gay. And yet, despite that, he is so very protective of Danny that it's almost like he was written as a boyfriend rival character, and then they decided that they weren't going to do that, but the character still goes through the movie picking fights. And at the end of the film, there's a moment where our main character has to confront Brian, and he says, it's okay to be gay. And suddenly, they're cool. And I'm thinking to myself, wait, hang on, was he supposed to be closeted? Because that doesn't really work. If you introduce the character by saying that he's gay right up front. What is happening in this movie? Who thought this was a good idea? And let's not even forget that at one point, this character of Brian tries to intimidate our hero by walking up to him and saying, I Google Chromed you. Like the browser? It doesn't help that our main character of Kyle is a total drip. Ross Lynch is really miscast in this movie, by the way, because we're expected to buy that someone like him would be unpopular in high school. The kid that goes around skating. Not buying it, movie. Although Lynch isn't given any help by the script, because the way the character is written, in the first opening scenes of the movie, he is painfully whiny and petulant to the point where he spends the whole first day of school sulking. Well, no wonder you don't have any friends. That's not going to win you any favours. But the reason he's so down in the mouth is because of the whole fact that his family's been separated and he wants to spend more time with his dad, who's played by Rob Riggle in the movie. You could sort of understand it if it weren't for the fact that it's very obvious that there was a reason why his mother, played by mclendon-covey, travelled across the country to get away from this guy. Even more so when the character actually shows up, because the first thing that Kyle does is wish for his dad to show up, and he does. And that just makes his home life agonisingly uncomfortable. I will say that Riggle actually plays this character fairly well. It's not one of his standard jerks. There's a bit more nuance and pathos to it, and you can sort of understand the relationship those two characters have with each other if it weren't for the fact that the father is a complete layabout wastrel who does nothing. He is basically a surfer dude that has never grown up and is totally pathetic. And you just wonder to yourself, why does Kyle look up to him? Why does Kyle prefer that option? Lynch does actually fare better in some of the more romantic scenes that he shares with his co-star Olivia Holt, and they do actually have a genuine chemistry with each other. I haven't seen Holt in anything else, but she's fairly cute and charming in this movie, but she's not really given a lot of acting to do. I get the impression that she's a singer, mostly, because this is one of those movies where they hire someone who's mostly known for that, and then basically give them as many excuses as they can to actually have them show off their talent. There are so many scenes that are just basically there to give a chance for Olivia Holt to sing, but there is a lot of fairly recognisable faces in this movie, and a lot of them come away tarnished by it. I've already mentioned Wendy mclendon-covey. She isn't given much room to be funny because she spends so much of the film side-eyeing Rob Riggle. But elsewhere, you've got John Michael Higgins playing the music teacher who basically seems to have been given the instruction, hey, you remember your character from Pitch Perfect? Can you do that with more dead cat jokes? Excellent. The genie character in this movie is played by a social media celebrity. Surprise! He's played by Josh Ostrovsky, who is known as the Fat Jewish on Instagram. He's only in 2 or 3 scenes of this movie, but he is excruciatingly annoying. He's trying to play this kind of hippie, new wave character, and they just make him the most infuriating presence on screen. There's a whole bit where he makes Ross Lynch flap his hands like a bird in the middle of a shopping mall. But by far the worst of these well-known names is Famke Janssen. This isn't a performance. This is a cry for help. She pops up about an hour into this movie playing Courtney Eaton's mother, and there's this scene where Kyle goes over to her parents' place and has dinner with them, and it goes terribly because they're in this unhappy marriage and they hate each other, so he makes a wish for them to like him, which apparently has the effect of turning her into a sex maniac, because suddenly she's lusting after him, and there is this elaborate sequence where he's running around a kitchen trying to evade her advances, and she is jumping over the kitchen countertops chasing after him. There is a moment where he pulls the tap out from the sink and hoses her down in an attempt for her to stop, and she just cavorts around in her wet dress like it's a t-shirt contest. And it is just jaw-dropping to witness. I felt so embarrassed for her watching this. It is really, really desperate stuff, and I honestly have to ask, is this the best that Famke Janssen is offered these days? A high-concept comedy like this, though, basically lives and dies on what you do with the premise, and at its heart, Status Update is basically a reskin of like some Bruce Almighty and Click, and you could do a lot with the central conceit, especially because the filmmakers give themselves so little rules. The only one there really is that if something goes wrong, you can type in another update that clears it. So you could take this in any kind of weird, absurdist direction, but instead, the film chooses the blandest, least imaginative route that it could think of. And the big set-piece moments, of which there are surprisingly few, really don't work. They fall flat most of the time. There's a moment where he wishes that he has the singing voice of Bruno Mars, which triggers off this big elaborate musical number in the high school cafeteria, but it's not funny. It's big elaborate production in service of nothing. There's a weird undercurrent to several of these jokes actually, because there's 2 sequences where he's going into auditions and he wishes that he could have a singing voice that blows them away, and he wishes that he could really impress them with his skating. And what happens in those scenes is that he suddenly sings with this really high falsetto opera voice, or he does this elaborate ice skating dance, and then everyone laughs at him. And this has the sort of implication of, well, that's unmasculine, as everyone's making jokes like, have your balls dropped yet? I mean, it's 2018, so people aren't going to be dropping homophobic slurs, but it's pretty clear that that's where the scenes were gesturing towards, and it's so lazy. And at the same time, I was thinking to myself, he just did an elaborate ice skating routine in front of you, completely on the fly? I don't buy that anyone would be laughing at that. That's just preposterous, even by comedy standards. And what makes this worse is that Kyle is really narrow-minded. He only uses his powers for himself pretty much exclusively. The only time he uses it for anyone else is to make his nerdy friend good at skateboarding, and then subsequently in the same sequence, embarrass the jock bully. That's the only time he ever uses it for anything other than to improve his own status. And in another movie, you'd argue, oh well, that's intentional. But in this movie, it just seems more like it's symptomatic of bad writing, and it feels like a stretch to claim that that's some kind of satirical element there. The movie doesn't do anything interesting with it. They don't have him come into conflict with another character that's using the app doesn't come well known, and the movie does try to have a good message about social media, about how it's not really real, and everyone's posting their highlights, you're not actually getting the reality of their day-to-day lives, which is good for its target audience, except it doesn't relate to what Kyle is going through because he's using this app in isolation. He's not comparing his status to anyone else. So even that doesn't really work. And the movie limits itself even further because it moves away from its central premise in its third act. It tries to go in a more dramatic direction that simply isn't earned by the material, and so it just becomes very, very boring in the home stretch, especially as it looms even further into cliche. The big conflict towards the end of the movie is whether he'll be able to make the big sing-off if he competes in the hockey game. Oh my gosh, I bet you've never seen a high school movie that ended with that exact same conflict. So yeah, Status Update is just as bad as its premise implies, and I can't believe this actually made it into cinemas because it's so flat and so uninspired. This actually had a wide UK cinema release, I kid you not, and yet it looks like something that should have gone either direct to video or straight onto the Disney Channel. That's where a lot of its cast members come from, including Ross Lynch himself, and it looks like it'd be right at home on there if it weren't for the fact they'd launched it up to a PG-13. So there's loads of inappropriate swearing and sex references that have absolutely no business being here because this is essentially a kids movie and would play best to them. As it stands, this is very much an early contender for my worst of 2018 list. Consider yourself warned. Status Update is an utterly dismal comedy that feebly tries to give an app-based spin on its wish-fulfillment premise, but its ideas are remarkably uninspired. The big comic set pieces are few and far between, and the film never does anything remotely creative with the setup, even though there's barely any rules or limits. Unfortunately, the film is clearly made by people for whom high school is long behind them, full of either cliches or hopeless attempts to try and understand modern culture that are laughable for the wrong reasons. Despite tenuously grafting a well-intentioned message about social media onto it, the movie barely resembles any experience on planet Earth, feeling like a mildly raunchy TV movie with embarrassed recognisable faces, Famke Janssen especially, that looks like it ended up in cinemas by mistake. If you like this review, then you don't need a magic app to join my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.